Let's go back to John Smith and King Lear. John Smith is peaceful and fulfilled. He has a nice life at home. But as soon as he takes the part of King Lear, he's miserable. And he's miserable because identifying himself with King Lear cuts him off from his innate peace and happiness. He forgets or overlooks his innate peace and happiness. This is what the word ignorance means in the Vedantic tradition. Ignorance doesn't mean stupidity, as it does in common parlance. It means the ignoring of who we essentially are, and therefore the ignoring of our innate peace and happiness. So he has fallen into ignorance. The same idea in the Christian tradition is called the fall. It is the fall into separation. So as soon as John Smith has assumed the role of King Lear, he becomes miserable. And if he is miserable, he is by definition seeking happiness. It's not possible to be miserable and not seek happiness. So King Lear is in a state of perpetual seeking. And this seeking is relieved by brief moments of happiness and deep sleep. So most of the time, King Lear seeks to bring his unhappiness to an end by the acquisition of an object, substance, state of mind, activity, or relationship. And these do indeed give him brief respites from his suffering, but it always comes back. So at some point, King Lear meets a friend, and his friend says to him, your suffering is not on account of your daughters, it is because you have forgotten yourself. And his friend begins to lead him back on this journey. Who are you really, King Lear? And so King Lear starts to describe, I am the King of Denmark, I have 3 daughters, etc. And then his friend says, no, but prior to all of that, who are you? And his friend encourages King Lear to trace his experience back through the layers of thought and feeling until he gets to that essential, irreducible element of himself. And when he gets to that point, there is this recognition, I am John Smith. And with that recognition comes the peace and fulfillment that is inherent in being John Smith. So the question arises, who recognizes I am John Smith? Does King Lear recognize I am John Smith? No. So it's John Smith that recognizes I am John Smith. So then we could ask, but who seeks happiness? Who falls into ignorance? And who seeks happiness? Well, John Smith is obviously not seeking happiness because his nature is happiness. He doesn't need to seek happiness. When he knows himself as John Smith, he's perfectly happy. But nor can we say that King Lear seeks happiness because King Lear is not an entity that can either fall into ignorance or seek happiness. So, however, as a concession to King Lear's belief that he is indeed King Lear, a separate self, cut off from his source, John Smith, as a concession to King Lear's belief in himself as a separate self, the teaching will say, okay, stop seeking happiness through the acquisition of objects, substances, etc. Turn your attention round and investigate who you really are. It's only when you discover who you really are that you will find the lasting peace for which you long. So, although the teaching understands full well that there is no real character called King Lear, at the same time, if the teaching said nothing to King Lear's misery would just continue. So as a concession to him, the teaching says, okay, King Lear, I suggest you stop paying attention to your daughters and the way your relationships with them, etc., and you ponder very deeply the nature of yourself. So we can say, relatively speaking, that it is King Lear that seeks happiness, the separate self. But it's not quite right. What would be more accurate, again, not completely accurate, none of these models are completely accurate, but what would be more accurate would be, let me forget about King Lear for the time being. Let's take another analogy. Take a rubber ball, a big rubber ball that is in its normal condition in a state of equilibrium. This represents the peace of awareness. Yeah? Now imagine squashing that rubber ball, contracting it. So you now have a tiny little, the large rubber ball, infinite awareness, whose nature is equilibrium or harmony or peace, has been contracted into a small ball. That's the finite, that's each of our minds, a limitation of infinite awareness. Now, in this contracted state, there is an inherent force in the contracted ball that is tending to return the ball to its natural state of equilibrium. So in the contracted ball, there is this force that is acting on the contracted ball, trying to return it to its original state. Now, that force is the desire for happiness. Like when each of our minds, when consciousness shrinks into each of our minds, there is an inevitable force that acts on each of our minds, that demands that each of our minds seeks happiness. And that is why all separate selves spend their entire lives seeking happiness. The search for happiness is wired into the separate self, because the separate self feels separate, cut off, alone, cut off from the source of peace and happiness. Therefore the separate self is always seeking. The separate self feels, I do the seeking. It is me, I, the self, that is seeking happiness. It's not the contracted ball that is initiating the return. There is a force, there is an inevitable force that acts on this contracted ball that is always trying to return it to its natural condition. So from the point of view, what is from the point of view of the separate self called the search for happiness is, from the point of view of consciousness, called grace. Grace is the inevitable force that is pulling the separate self back to its whole or unseparate condition. But the separate self, King Lear feels, I am seeking happiness. He's not. He's responding to the pull from John Smith, saying, come back to me, come back to yourself.
So it is grace that makes John Smith pulling back his attention from King Lear.
Yes, grace is the pull from John Smith on King Lear. Yeah. It's the pull that says to King Lear, stop looking for me in objects and relationships. Stop looking for me in front of you. Turn round, I am behind you. Remember Lala, the Kashmir Shaivite mystic. She said, I have traveled for so long in search of God, but when I finally stopped and turned back, there he was within me. What we feel as the desire for happiness is in fact awareness pulling us back, pulling the mind back to itself, saying, turn round, come back to me. I'm right behind you. You're just looking for me in the wrong direction.